The most fundamental theme of this course is the simple idea that everything psychological is biological. In other words, all of our thoughts, feelings, emotion, and everyday experience is created by biology operating inside our brain and the rest of our nervous system. Every story of biology always starts with a bit of evolution because it's the tale of how our biology came to be the way that it is. And understanding the history of the human nervous system is really important to understanding how we think and behave today because we carry the legacy within us of many of our ancestors. So every tale of evolution starts with a timeline. You see, here we are in 2020, and we can count backwards in billions of years to chart the history of the Earth. The Earth itself is about 4.5 billion years old, but for the first billion or so years that the Earth existed, it was devoid of life. Life appeared about 3.5 billion years ago. And this early life on Earth was very simple. It was single-celled organisms that were just floating around inside the ocean, and these single-celled organisms ruled the Earth for a couple billion years. So the communication needs of these simple creatures were fairly simple themselves. Any communication they needed to do, they did by secreting chemicals directly into the water, where they could be absorbed by other microorganisms. As you can see, we've already gotten pretty close to the present day on our timeline, so we've got to zoom in on that last billion years. So here we are with just 1 billion years on our timeline, and at this point, single-celled organisms still dominate the Earth. Just under 1 billion years ago, life exploded into several new forms, and the kingdoms of life we're familiar with today, like plants and animals, evolved. And early on in the lives of animals, this communication system that had been sufficient for single-celled organisms just excreting chemicals out into the water was no longer sufficient for what an animal needed to do. The animal had to coordinate movement across a larger body filled with cells, and it had to have a way of communicating between different parts of its body. And that's the reason that the earliest nerve cells appeared. And these nerve cells evolved along with the muscles that they served. So the first purpose of a nerve cell was simply to make a muscle contract and to help the organism to move. And shortly after nerve cells evolved, they began to get a little bit more organized. So the first real nervous system that we see in life's history evolved about 600 million years ago underwater in a creature that was an ancestor to modern-day sea anemone and jellyfish. So these are simple creatures that are either fixed on the floor of the ocean or floating about, drifting in the current. And all they really need to do to survive is take in nutrients and move their bodies in order to move that nutrient through the body. Whoa, I don't know how to point. So if we look at the nervous system of this sea anemone, it's quite simple. The nerves are spread out in a loose net, evenly distributed throughout the animal's body. And they help it to detect nutrients in the water, and when those nutrients are absorbed, they contract to move the food through the animal's digestive system. Why do we care about the nervous system of a jellyfish? Well, actually, one of the most interesting and mysterious parts of our own nervous system is modeled on exactly this structure. So our enteric nervous system, which is the system that controls our gut and digestion, looks just like the nervous system of this jellyfish. It's a loose net. So we're carrying that evolutionary legacy of this ancient ancestor inside our bodies today. So your book presents this image where we see the common ancestor of all animals represented down here in this corner, and then we see that as we move across the image, movement is getting more and more complex. So for the sea anemone, it was anchored. All it had to do was move food through its body. But pretty quickly, new types of body styles were evolved in the animal kingdom, and these new bodies needed new nervous systems to coordinate them. So if you take a look at our little flatworm here, you see that his body has bilateral symmetry, meaning that if you fold him down the middle, both sides match. And we still carry this bodily organization today. And this flatworm had a much more complex form of movement compared to the jellyfish, which you can see here. Oh, beautiful. And in order to create these movements, the flatworm needed a much more complex nervous system. So it's a segmented trunk, and you have nerves going out from the center. And we actually use in our peripheral nervous system, the nerves that move the limbs of our body is organized really similarly. So once again, we're carrying that legacy forward. The next step in the changes in animal body style brought us to new forms of movement and new behaviors that required an even more sophisticated nervous system. So here we see the appearance of ganglia. A ganglia is just a cluster of nerves, and the singular is ganglion, and they are sitting right next to the organ they service, and they act as a sort of a mini brain. And once again, this system is also in the human body. So when you get nervous and you feel that your heart beat faster or you start to sweat, it is a system of ganglia servicing your interior organs that creates that arousal. And we're going to learn about how that part of the peripheral nervous system works next week. So all of these body changes happened really quickly, just over 500 million years ago. But we still haven't gotten to that moment we're waiting for, which is the appearance of the first true brain. So the first brain evolved 500 million years ago in a chordate. Chordates are a phylum of animal, and it's the phyla we belong to. And a chordate simply means any animal with a brain and spinal cord. So here's a couple example chordates, real cuties. We've got a doggo and a horse, but all chordates are beautiful, even our hagfish over here. Now, these early brains in our chordate ancestors were pretty simplistic. So the image I have here is of a brain with frog legs, because these early brains that evolved in an amphibian-like ancestor of ours were really pretty simple. If you think about the behaviors that a frog can engage in, most of it's automatic. The frog will orient its head when it hears a sound. It will automatically flick out its tongue to catch a fly, but it doesn't need to use a lot of conscious thought or reasoning to produce those behaviors. And we have a lot of automatic responses that form the basis of human behavior, and they're still to this day generated by this ancient reptilian brain that is still inside of us. So this was discussed in the NPR piece that we listened to. Evolution is sort of like that cheap relative that you have, an auntie or a grandma. Mine's my granny. She's from the Depression era. She was washing plastic bags and reusing them, carrying a handbag she bought in 1991. She doesn't throw anything away. And evolution works the same way. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. So once we had evolved a brain that was capable of producing these lizard-like responses to the world, this simple automatic behavior, we never threw that part of the brain away. We just evolved more and more layers on top of it. And Sapolsky numbers these layers off. He calls the so-called lizard brain layer 1, and then the second area to evolve, the limbic system, which is responsible for emotion, he calls the mammal brain, and you see that there as layer 2. And then finally, the cortex, which is what we think of when we think of the appearance of a brain, all of this folded tissue that is all around the outside, he's calling layer 3. So inside we have down here layer 1, here is layer 2, and grown all over the top is layer 3. So we've got to zoom in again to see these layers appear on the scene in evolutionary time. So at 500 million years ago, our ancestors had evolved a reptile brain capable of producing basic responses. It took another 250 million years for mammals to evolve, and with them a new set of brain structures that enabled more complex behavior. So as Sapolsky said, lizards aren't really known for their emotional lives, but we mammals are capable of more complex feelings. We feel fear, we feel love, we feel desire, and this motivates a lot of human behavior to this day. And so we're going to find out how these little structures here deep inside the brain affect a lot of what we do on a day-to-day basis. Now here is where the story gets juicy. The appearance of the cortex. The cortex is the seat of our conscious experience. So everything that we're able to perceive from the world around us and all of our logical thoughts, the narrative that's running inside your head as you go throughout your day, that's all generated by the cortex. Compared to other animals, humans have a much higher percentage of cortex compared to other brain regions. And one way that humans have adapted to fit all that juicy cortex into the confines of the skull is by creating all these wrinkles and folds that allow for more cortex surface area. So, a quick clarification. I'm using images of a modern-day lizard, zebra, and primate to represent these three distinct layers in which the brain that would eventually become our human brain evolved. But I want to make it clear that these cutesy zoo animals are nothing like the actual creatures in which these brain regions originally evolved. So just for context, let me give you a better picture of what the Earth was actually like 500 million years ago when the earliest chordates evolved very simple brainstems. So all life on Earth had been underwater right up until this time period, about 500 million years ago. There were no animals or plants on land. Just about 500 million years ago, some clever creatures started exploring the land, and it was around the same time that the brainstem evolved in the very first chordate, which again is the beautiful hagfish, which we see pictured here. After the evolution of this hagfish, plants began to dominate the land, and life on land got pretty crowded and kind of fantastic. So these creatures that you see here are not the dinosaurs. They're an even more ancient sort of proto-reptilian ancestor that ruled the Earth before 250 million years ago, when a really insane extinction event wiped out 96% of the species on the Earth. And it's that crazy extinction that made space for the rise of the dinosaurs. And here, the length of the image of dinosaurs here represents their time on Earth from 250 million years ago to about halfway through the last 100 million years. So it was around 250 million years ago in a little rat-like creature that was scampering around under the feet of the dinosaurs that the mammal brain first evolved. And very quickly, kind of alongside it, the neocortex evolved as well. So I could have made the chart look like this and it would be a little bit more accurate, but also kind of gross. So we're going to go with these cute and much more familiar animals that we know today, because it's going to be important to remember how lizards act, how zebras, dogs, and other mammals act, and how hominids and humans act when we think about the functions that are performed by these three distinct layers of the brain. So, moving forward just a bit, we find that it isn't until 6 million years ago, so really very close to now on the time scale of how long life has existed, that the first human-like brain evolved in one of our hominid ancestors. And finally, the first anatomically modern humans evolved 200,000 years ago. Okay, so we've zoomed in so many times on this timeline that I think it's easy to sort of lose the perspective of these most recent and important events in the evolution of the nervous system. So let's put it all back into perspective on this big picture timeline. If you stand with your arms outstretched and let the fingertips of your right hand represent the formation of the Earth itself. Life began at your right elbow and persisted as only single-celled organisms all the way until your left elbow. A couple inches past your left elbow, the earliest nervous systems evolved, and it's down by your wrist that we see the evolution of mammals with the limbic system and cortex. The modern human brain didn't come to be until the very tip of your finger, and all of human recorded history could be erased with the swipe of a nail file. So some big changes took place right here in the timeline. The ancestor in which the first human-like brain evolved about 6 million years ago was much more like a modern-day ape, both in terms of its behavior and its cognitive ability. All of the brain components that make up the modern human brain were there, but the brains of that animal were about half the size of the brains we see in modern-day humans. It's important to point out that our species, Homo sapiens sapien, is only one of many different types of hominids that were prolific on the face of the earth in this time period a couple million years ago. And scientists are still figuring out the exact family tree of who descended from whom, and it's a really big unsolved mystery as to why we were the winners of the competition to dominate the earth. So what changed over just the past couple million years from our much more ape-like ancestors to the complex humans that we are today? The biggest difference is that the human brain exploded in size. So you can see here that about 3.5 million years ago, the human brain was only about half as big as the modern human brain is today. And the question we have to ask is, why did our ancestors evolve such huge and complex brains? Remember, evolution is a cheapskate. It's not going to go inventing features and body parts that aren't crucial to the organism's survival. And the human brain is expensive in terms of the calories it requires. Your brain only weighs about 3 pounds. That's probably about 2% of your body weight. But this greedy monster gobbles down fully 1/5 of the calories you consume in a day. So if you're like me and you like 5 meals, hello midnight snack, one of those meals goes to feeding your brain every single day. So the body wasn't going to evolve such a calorically expensive organ if it wasn't crucial to human survival. What was it about the lives of our hominid ancestors that pressured them into growing such big and expensive brains? Gosh, I probably just made your ears explode. I can't do that.